Welcome to the Chesterton Institute online conference on the Global Chesterton Series on the topic of Chesterton Upside Down, the Australian Experience. Good afternoon to all of us who are in the United States. Good evening to our friends in Europe, and good Friday morning to our friends in Australia. We welcome our Chestertonian friends that join us from the United States, Canada, Europe, and Australia. We thank you for joining us on this online event, which is a conversation with Karl Schmude, President of the Australian Chesterton Society and editor of The Defendant, and Dr. Dermot Quinn, Professor of History and editor of the Chesterton Review. G.K. Chesterton liked to say that the way to see the world the right way round is to see it upside down. He had a topsy-turvy imagination, a love for turning things inside out. It is fitting then that he should be so popular in Australia, a down-under place if there was ever one. Chesterton's novels and short stories have enjoyed widespread acclaim within the Australian reading public. His political and economic ideas have resonated with several generations of Australian thinkers. His personality seems almost Australian in its buoyancy and exuberance. Chesterton had the quality of sprawl, so memorably described by the Australian poet Les Murray. He was from Beaconsfield by way of Brisbane and Ballarat. This online event is also a tribute to Father Boyd. Father Ian Boyd was the founder and president emeritus of the Chesterton Institute and now founding editor of the Chesterton Review. In August 1990, at the invitation of the, I believe it was newly formed Chesterton Society and the generosity of one of its early members, Frank Hill, he traveled to Australia. One of the goals of his visit was to discuss the more active participation by the Australian Society in the Chesterton Institute. That visit has grown to a deep and close relationship that continually grows between the Australian Chesterton Society and the Chesterton Institute for Faith and Culture, along with a continued revival and interest in Chesterton in Australia over the years. Today, Dr. Dermot Quinn and Karl Schmude will study too, Chesterton Down Under. Why has Chesterton made such an impact on Australia? What lessons should we learn from this for other parts of the world? Who are the leading Chestertonian writers and thinkers in Australia today? Before we get started, it is my pleasure now to introduce to you to our speakers. Our friend and guest, Karl Schmude, is president of the Australian Chesterton Society, a member of the editorial board of the Chesterton Review, and author of the biographical booklet G.K. Chesterton, published by the Catholic Truth Society in London in 2008. He is co-founder of Australia's first liberal arts institution on higher education, Campion College in Sydney. It was established in 2006. And he is a former university librarian at the University of New England in Armidale, North South Wales. Dr. Dermot Quinn is Professor of History at Seton Hall University and editor of the Chesterton Review. He was educated at Trinity College, Dublin, and New College in Oxford, where he was awarded a doctorate in 1986. He has written extensively on Chestertonian themes, has authored 3 books, and has written many articles and reviews in the field of British and Irish history. After our conversation segment, we will have a question and answer period. If you have any questions, kindly post them in the chat function of this event. And if due to time we are not able to answer your questions, please send them by email to chestertoninstitute@shu.edu, indicating who the question is directed to, one or both of our speakers, and they will be able to send you a reply. Please note that this presentation is being recorded. If you do not wish to be featured on the video, kindly turn off your camera. I now leave you with our speakers, Karl Schmude and Dr. Dermot Quinn. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Gloria, and welcome to everybody, either here in the United States or in Europe, or, as Gloria says, good morning. I think it's Good Thursday morning in Australia, and I'm delighted that we're able to bring each other, bring all of us together, thanks to the marvels of this new technology, and it's a really great pleasure to be in conversation with Australia's greatest living Chestertonian, Karl Schmude, who has been, such a wonderful presence for Chesterton and a wonderful promoter of Chesterton in Australia over many years. And it's obviously a great pleasure to be talking about Australia, that great and extravagantly beautiful country. I've been to Australia. I spent a bit of time in Australia a few years ago, not enough time, but enough time to discover, its beauties. And I suppose in a way to discover its, from the point of view of a European and from the point of view of an Irishman, something of its strangeness. And, I think when I think of Australia of that wonderful poem by Dorothea Mackellar, My Country, which I imagine is learned off by heart by Australians from a very young age. But let me quote a little of Dorothea Mackellar's poem My Country. I love a sunburned country, a land of sweeping plains, of ragged mountain ranges, of droughts and flooding plains. I love her far horizons. I love her jewel sea, her beauty and her terror, the wide brown land for me. And I think in a way that that wide brown land that Dorothea Mackellar talks about is what a lot of sort of non-Australians think of when they think of Australia. They recognise the beauty of Australia, but also in some ways it's for want of a better word, it's exoticism. It's not the kind of place that Europeans are familiar with from their own experience. And in a way, that's really a way of kind of framing our conversation, because Chesterton tended to think of countries, allegorically. Chesterton had a sort of an allegorical imagination, so that countries became, if you like, metaphors for some argument that he was making. Ireland, for example, and Poland were examples of a sort of resurrection story. I mean, Poland rising from the dead, as it were, after the First World War, Ireland rising from the ashes after the 1916 uprising, and so on. So Chesterton had that allegorical imagination when it came to countries, and as Karl and I will, I imagine, discover as we chat about it, he had very distinctive views of Australia. And maybe not quite as favourable as his views of Ireland or Poland or whatever. But he does talk a lot about European countries in his writing, but not so much about Australia. Nonetheless, Australia does get, so to speak, honourable mention in, for example, his the very first pages of Orthodoxy. His great apologetic work of 1909. When he says, "What could be more glorious than to brace oneself up to discover New South Wales, and discover with a gush of happy tears that it was really old South Wales." And so there he is, giving a tip of the hat to Australia in the opening pages of Orthodoxy. And I think in a way, that description or that sense of Australia being a very, very far away place, remote, and maybe indeed requiring you to brace yourself in order to visit it. That I think is in some ways that is the point, that you're happy to return to Old South Wales because that's home, and Australia is, for Chesterton, obviously not home. In his lovely little book on G.F. Watts, there's a passage which made me smile when I came across it. There is no detail from buttons to kangaroos that does not enter into the happy confusion of philosophy. There is no fact of life from the death of a donkey to the general post office, which is not its place to dance and sing in the glorious carnival of theology. So even kangaroos have their place in the glorious carnival of theology. So Chesterton, had a particular view of particular countries, and he had some views which he expresses, en passant in his writings about Australia. So that's why it's so wonderful to have Karl Schmude with us to have a conversation about it, because Karl is not only the president of the Australian Chesterton Society, but has written extensively on Chesterton, and indeed has written a wonderful piece on Chesterton and Australia. So maybe what we might do, Karl, is talk a little about, first of all, Chesterton and Australia, and then we might look at the contemporary Chestertonian scene in Australia. So, Karl, what, very, very simply, was Chesterton's attitude to Australia? And I think you're muted, Karl, so you might want to unmute yourself if we can manage that. There you are.
Yes. Well, I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you for this opportunity. The question you pose is a fundamental one, Chesterton's attitude to Australia, because as you indicated earlier, he was not necessarily favourably disposed to Australia, and we might come to that in a moment. But what you do touch on, for example, the physical beauty of the country, just to give a couple of examples, the first two slides, if they can be put on the screen. The first is one of Sydney Harbour. Pretty recognisable view, a splendid, huge harbour, where the key monuments are the Harbour Bridge on the right, and then the very distinctive architecture of the Sydney Opera House on the left. And then another rural scene, the second slide, is the famous Blue Mountains just west of Sydney. And there's various scenes like that in Australia, in Victoria and elsewhere that really are enormously impressive. So the fact that Chesterton's great artistic eye, he didn't seem to be very aware of Australia's physical beauty is curious. A second dimension, I think, of why he might have warmed to Australia is the fact that it is a small, independent nation, and the particular basis of it we'll come to. But the way that it's evolved, the way, as you mentioned, it had changed over the years, the strong democratic dimensions and structures and attitudes of the people, the egalitarian impulses, even the sympathising with the victims of social oppression, those that settled in Australia at the time of British settlement in the late 18th century were convicts. So Australia was really established as a jail, very different therefore from, say, the North American experience, and particularly the United States, where there was this great vision of, in Abraham Lincoln's famous words, of an almost chosen people coming to the new world. And there was none of that grand picture that dominated the Australian imagination. Most of the convicts, the early convicts, were Irish, and Chesterton, as you mentioned, had a great love of Ireland, wrote 2 books on Ireland. The third slide, for example, will highlight Irish impressions, which is wonderful, provides wonderful insights into Ireland, and then another one further, which I haven't got a slide for, Christendom in Dublin. As with America, where he wrote, again, a couple of books, and very often, as well as being published in America, wrote favourably about America. That wasn't the case in Australia. So I suppose the irony of it is that no country, arguably, more than Australia, took his ideas seriously. From very early days, the various countries, such as in the United States, Canada, England, of course, but very early in the piece, we can come to that. There was this very great interest in Chesterton, particularly on the part of Catholics, but not confined to Catholics. It was Chesterton's always had that wonderful capacity, I think, to transcend any of those sorts of differences and divisions, and project a unifying vision of faith and culture.
Yeah, and I think, sorry if I could interrupt, Karl, I think you were also inclined to argue that Chesterton knew one very great Australian, and that was Frank Sheed, and on the basis of that knowledge, you might think that he would have warmed to Australia a little more. Do you want to say a little about that?
Indeed, yes. Well, that's correct. I think Maisie Ward facetiously on one occasion mentioned the wife of Frank Sheed and the founders of that great publishing company, Sheed and Ward, which published many of Chesterton's later books. Thought that Chesterton's exposure to Sheed may have had a warping effect on his attitude to Australia, but having had the privilege of knowing Frank Sheed personally, and of course, you know, his books continue to be popular, they continue to be reprinted. They're so readable, they're so full of insights that it's hard to believe that he would be other than admired by Chesterton. So yes, so that but it's a further reason to sort of wonder, well, you know, did he know some other Australians who he may not have warmed to, and that had a as it were, a distorting effect on his attitudes. He never came to Australia, although there is a suggestion in Dennis Conlon's biography a few years ago of G.K. Chesterton, a reappraisal, that in the last year of his life, he and Francis were booked by ship to come to Australia, which is perhaps a little difficult to credit, given that his health would not have been very good, and of course the journey would have been a tremendously long one, particularly for Francis, who didn't travel well. So
yeah, I think you're certainly right there, Karl. I mean, I was unaware of that until you pointed it out in your paper. But on the face of it, it seems rather implausible that Chesterton could have undertaken such a journey. You know, given his real kind of physical decline in the last couple of years of his life. I should, by the way, just as a completely irrelevant footnote, point out that Frank Sheed is actually buried in New Jersey. He's buried in Jersey City, which is just not so very many miles from where we are at the moment. So all things are local, as Chesterton pointed out, and I just wanted to give a little shout out to Jersey City. But sorry, I was interrupting the flow of your observations. So in other words, there are all sorts of reasons why Chesterton ought to have liked Australia. And reasons why basically all of us should like Australia, because you know, these are powerful, compelling qualities in Australia. It's kind of friendly egalitarianism. It's in some significant ways it's anti-authoritarianism, which would certainly appeal to Chesterton. It's physical beauty, which appeals, as you say, to his artist's eye, or ought to have appealed to his artist's eye. So it may be that he was simply content with a few sort of warmed over prejudices, and had he ever gone to Australia, he might well have changed his mind. I mean, for example, I was thinking the other day about the way in which Canada has a kind of analogous sort of place in Chesterton's imagination, and he found fault with Canada for reasons that we might explore whenever you talk about Australia. But the fact of the matter is he did go to Canada, and having gone to Canada, he delighted in it. I mean, he was given a wonderful reception. He became a sort of sort of national celebrity for a while. Everybody wanted to see him. There are famous stories of his giving public lectures in St. Michael's College in Toronto, which Father Boyd would certainly remember. No, he wasn't there at the lecture, but for Chesterton, Canada, did play a part in this kind of allegorical imagination of his until he actually went there, and then he discovered the reality and not simply the picture postcard that he had painted in his own mind. So it seems to me, just to kind of build on what you're saying, Karl, that if Australia had, if Chesterton had gone to Australia, he would have warmed to it immediately, in the same way as he warmed to Canada.
I'm sure that's right, Dermot. Yes, I think, it can sound frivolous, but as Gloria mentioned in her introductory remarks, Chesterton had a great love of the topsy-turvy and seeing the world upside down. The famous description of St. Peter being crucified upside down in one of his novels, and that he would see the landscape as it really is, with the stars like flowers and the clouds like hills, and the whole world hanging on the mercy of God, as I recall it, perhaps not fully incorrectly. But the idea of people having to walk upside down, requiring special magnetic shoes so that they don't fall off the planet, the seasons all in reverse, that one would have thought, even at, as I say, at a superficial level, might have excited Chesterton's imagination. So the fact that it didn't, I suppose, just looking at more seriously what deterred him, what failed to warm his sympathies. I think perhaps one way of looking at that is because his comments, as you pointed out, he didn't write anything substantial on Australia. I'm not even aware of certainly no books, but even substantial pieces. But so they're tucked away in the nooks and crannies of his essays and his novels, and as you mentioned at one point in Orthodoxy. But he did say in one of his essays published in The Well and the Shallows, so one of his last essays, that he referred to Australia as a raw and remote colony under the Southern Cross. And I think it might help in trying to explore Chesterton's understanding of Australia if we look at each of those words and what he was trying to convey with that. I mean, for example, if we take raw, and this seems to come through Chesterton's odd references to Australia, I think he saw it as a primitive place, really unfinished, crude, perhaps vulgar. I mean, he wasn't around when, say, Crocodile Dundee was on a movie. But if we go to the slide 6, and we see Crocodile Dundee there, then the just an earlier slide, I think, than that one. There's Crocodile Dundee, the one that has come up. There it is, with his friendly crocodile in hand. Well, that might have confirmed, if Chesterton had seen that movie, his worst worries about Australia's primitiveness. Ava Gardner, when she came to Australia with Gregory Peck in the late 1950s to make the movie On the Beach, it was set in Melbourne, and she's reputed to have said rather famously that to a journalist that this is a movie about the end of the world, escaped to Australia because nuclear obliteration in the Northern Hemisphere. That was the theme of the novel On the Beach and the movie. Yes, so she'd come to the movie was about the end of the world, and she thought Melbourne was a very appropriate place in which to set it. So that Melbourneites, of course, apart from all Australians, would have found that amusing. Really.
It rather reminds me, Karl, forgive me for interrupting, George Bernard Shaw's answer to the question, where do you want to be at the end of the world? And he said, I want to be in Ireland because it's always 50 years behind the time. So maybe Melbourne and Ireland have something in common in that respect.
Yes, that's right. So anyhow, there's that raw dimension. Really, the second adjective he uses is remote, and again, you adverted to this in your earlier remarks, but very, very distant. It's at the end of the world. One of our great Australian novelists, Christopher Koch, the author of The Year of Living Dangerously, made into a movie later, he described Australia as marooned in the southern hemisphere. So very distant from the centres of civilization, certainly as seen through European eyes. That sense of remoteness and therefore almost beyond understanding. And then the key word, I think, which touches very much on a core reason for his aversion to Australia in many ways, and that is it's a colony. And of course, being a product of imperialism and the British Empire in particular, he had a deep contempt for imperialism and for the British Empire as an empire, which I think also might bring up the point you well made about his attitude to Canada, that Canada being part of the British Commonwealth, the later manifestation of the empire, that it would have been tainted in this way. Yes.
Just kind of to reinforce that, Karl. There of course were two Canadas. There was British Canada and French Canada, and he had a very distinctively different view of some of the achievements of French Canada, Catholic Canada, he in fact in your paper you quote an extract from. I can't quite remember where it's from, but I actually quote it myself. This is his sort of, well, as you say, contempt for empire and colonialism, essentially his argument is that the colonies have never produced an indigenous literature. They simply are producing pale imitations of the metropolitan literature. Here's what he says: is the first-rate writers of the new countries are really almost exactly like the second-rate writers of the old countries, which is a line that you quote in your paper. Then the line that follows that is, what really moves their souls with a kindly terror is not the mystery of the wilderness, but the mystery of the hansom cab. And, that ties in rather neatly, I think, with your wonderful images of Australia as a wilderness. Had Chesterton gone to Australia he would have seen what he actually celebrates here, and that is the fact that there is a kind of rawness or wild beauty to Australia, to Canada, to wherever, and instead of actually generating an indigenous literature, colonials are simply in the business of imitating, the metropolitan culture, which, by the way, is kind of a bit ironic and paradoxical, because here we are ourselves, two colonials, admiring Chesterton, and I think he might have pointed to the awkwardness of that fact, but nonetheless, his basic argument is that why should these places be imitation Englands when they could be authentic Australias?
That's right. That's right. I mean, I've thought a great deal, as one would, about what are the deeper levels going on in Chesterton's prodigious imagination and mind, Dermot. And I think part of it, given that his first sign of opposition to imperialism came out with his opposition to the Boer War in South Africa in 1899 to 1904. The slide number 9, I think, is the one that just has some, reasonably well-known painted scene of on that slide of the Boer War. But Chesterton defended the Boers, particularly admiring them for protecting their farms. And I think his problem with colonies, any colonies, without starting to look more closely at the people who were colonised and the people who actually might have carried out the colonisation and how the interactions actually took place, is that he did see the triumph of big powers over small, which of course he had a very profound antipathy to valuing small units and family ties and local loyalties. I think he could see those being destroyed by the imperial impulse, and then found other things which didn't prove entirely accurate about how lacking in creativity colonies were, whereas I think Canada and Australia, as two examples, have produced great creativity in all sorts of ways, including in literature.
Yeah, I mean, sorry again, I beg your pardon for interrupting, Karl. I was just going to reinforce that point. Chesterton wrote an essay in 1904 called The Patriotic Idea. And if I could just quote two little sentences from that, it kind of, I think, makes your point. First of all, about empires, he says, an empire has all the characteristics that render national attachments impossible. It is huge. It is mostly remote. It is everywhere diverse and contradictory. Above all, it is utterly undefined and unlimited. So, I mean, there's a kind of basic distaste for, an empire, both in principle and in practice, as huge, remote, contradictory, undefined, unlimited. And as we well know, Chesterton loved limits. I mean, that's almost the kind of defining fact of Chesterton's imagination, is the liberty that comes from limitation. And then maybe here's another little sentence from that great essay, which kind of reinforces your point as well, when he's talking about the nature of patriotism. I mean, it's an essay called, The Patriotic Idea. A man is a citizen of that commonwealth, the nature of which he can conceive and no other. If that commonwealth is only a street out of the Blackfriars Road, that street is his country. And for that he ought to wear ribbons or shed his blood. The danger of small commonwealths is narrowness, but their advantage is reality. And I think that's a kind of a wonderful little summary of Chesterton's localism, which is ultimately incarnational, of course. The danger of small commonwealths is narrowness, but their advantage is reality. And of course, by indirection, what he means by that is that empires are unreal, that they are simply so big that you can't get your head around them. That is that's kind of, I think, your basic argument, isn't it?
That's right. And I've often thought about Rudyard Kipling and what he wrote about, particularly in the book Heretics in 1905, Dermot, where he really, I think, criticised Kipling in a way that was a broader criticism of imperialism. And he saw Kipling, I think, as cosmopolitan, a citizen of many communities, and in that sense a member of none, because, as Chesterton said, he does not cherish that final and tragic loyalty to any cause or community. He had a wonderful paradox, and he called Kipling a man of the world with all the narrowness that belongs to those imprisoned in that planet. So I think, yes, for Chesterton, imperialism offended his devotion to the land, to the local, to the concrete, as you say, to the incarnational. And he had such a deep understanding of incarnational reality, which I think was very important as a child. He showed that, say, with the toy theatre and in all sorts of other ways, which opened his mind and heart, I think, later to a wonderful appreciation of Christianity and finally Catholicism. So those are really underlying attitudes, I think, that dictated his view of what he presumed Australia was like. And while it didn't match the reality, he didn't, as in the case of Canada, as you mentioned, have the opportunity at least to be on the ground, speak with people in that country, and see how they loved their country.
Just kind of pushing that argument a little farther, Karl. I think your paper makes this claim, which is an extremely interesting one, and that is that there is a kind of a double emptiness in Australia. There is, the emptiness of the land, the landscape. I mean, it's a vast continent, in many places uninhabited, some places uninhabitable. But it's also, as you very arrestingly say, there's a kind of metaphysical emptiness in Australia. And could you kind of explore that idea for us a little more? Because I think that's the key to your argument, and in a sense, it's also the key, the way in which the argument turns. Because Chesterton, having exhibited a degree of hostility to Australia, nonetheless has been embraced by Australia, and it all kind of hinges on this kind of, as you might say, metaphysical loneliness, which in some significant ways Chesterton answers. So could you tell us what you mean by the kind of the metaphysical emptiness of Australia?
Yes, I think and it has appeared in our literature. There's a slide, for example, of the novel Voss, VOSS, by Australia's only Nobel Prize winner in literature, Patrick White. That's slide number 13, and that's Patrick White there with the cover of his book. Now, it's one example. The Thornbirds, a remarkably popular book by Colin McCulloch, the Australian author, in the 1970s, and it was later made into a mini-series. Slide 14, the next slide, which had Richard Chamberlain and a very young Rachel Ward in that. So both of those were very much set in the outback. And so this tremendous image of the physical barrenness of Australia, the empty continent, did reflect a certain spiritual emptiness. And Australia, in many ways, I think it could be argued, was the first post-Christian culture. It was very obviously a Christian in terms of its founders and its victims, those who brought colonial rule to Australia and ran the jails, and the convicts were all came from European Christian backgrounds. But I think there's a strong argument, despite the very intense sectarian feelings between Catholics and Protestants, just encapsulated, I guess, in Irish Catholic convicts, for example, who were very much an oppressed group, and the dominant ruling class, which was Anglican, was Protestant, with an admixture of nonconformist churches, Presbyterian, Methodists, as time went on, that despite the sectarian hostilities, and they're part of Australian history and can't be ignored, of course, but I think underlying those, which has become more apparent as the years have rolled on, was a neutralisation of religion as something that should be private, but not really affect the public culture. And while it did affect and shape the public culture, while the underlying assumptions were shared, Christian assumptions, by Protestant and Catholics alike, it was, in a sense, a deeply secularist culture, by the mere fact that religion was not something that was meant to be promoted publicly. And of course, as time has gone on, and we can talk about this a little later, where the culture has become more hostile to the public manifestations of religious and particularly Christian faith, the secularist thrust has really taken over for many sectarian ones, so that the anti-Catholicism that is part of the Australian story has moved from a sectarian ground of Catholics being at odds with Protestants and vice versa, to one where Catholics and Christians generally are at odds with secularists.
Yeah, and in some ways that's a kind of a description of a lot of kind of postmodern and post-industrial societies in the West. So, Karl, maybe if we could turn to the kind of the good news part of the story. This has been a series of kind of if not complaints, then lamentations about the way in which Chesterton somehow or other didn't quite get Australia. But it's pretty clear from what you are proposing in your talk that Australia, or some significant parts of Australia, got Chesterton, and that and not only Australia, but other parts of the empire, which we can talk about later perhaps. But this was the kind of the revenge of the colonialists, or the colonials, that they took Chesterton's arguments and used those arguments in a very, very significant way to understand their own societies and to rearrange their social arrangements. So could you talk a little about the way in which Chesterton was embraced in a rather dramatic way by Australia, and I suppose primarily the Australian Catholic community in the 1930s and 40s?
Yes, well, that certainly was the first period, I think, in which Chesterton really registered his impact on Australia. In the early 1930s, an association of lay Catholic professionals, intellectuals, started a society called the Campion Society, named after the 16th century scholar and martyr, St. Edmund Campion. The Campion Society, established in Melbourne, spread rapidly throughout Australia, including to rural parts, and across to the west, Western Australia. In fact, the branch of the Campion Society in Western Australia was named the Chesterton Club. So that was an indication of how central, I think, Chesterton's thought and influence were in the Campion movement. When the Campion Society spread into rural areas in Victoria and then across the border into New South Wales, the border town of Albury, where my father grew up, is the reason why I have an interest in Chesterton. He was exposed during this period to Chesterton's writings. He would have encountered Chesterton as a schoolboy, reading the occasional essay, The Advantages of Having One Leg, or something like that, that would have been in anthologies. But the serious encounter with Chesterton's study of his great array of works certainly took place in the 1930s. And that was reflected in my father's library, so that when I was born in the late 1940s and was being brought up in the 1950s, 1960s, I really just absorbed that atmosphere. And in second year university at Sydney University, in the 1960s, a pretty turbulent era with the Vietnam War and so on going on campuses. But I was struggling a little bit with my faith, not in the sense of denying it, but wanting really to probe it more deeply. And Dad suggested I read orthodoxy, and so he passed to this 17-year-old kid this formidable book, and I lapped it up enormously, of course. So that, I think, the intellectual influence, therefore, in the 1930s, and it carried over into, in many cases, to the children of Campion Society members, was great. The other dimension that is so important was the political impact that Chesterton's influence had, particularly his ideas of social philosophy, his distributism, and Catholic action, both the Italian model that was mainly clerically centred, I think, and the Belgian model with Cardinal Cardin, which was very lay centred. And in fact, we've only in recent years an Australian Cardin Institute has been established in Australia, so his influence is continuing to have its effect. But those movements of Catholic action in Melbourne in particular, but throughout Australia, were influenced by Chesterton's ideas, certainly by the social encyclicals, of course, but I think Chesterton's popular way of presenting those ideas, making them more accessible to ordinary people, had their own impact. So both at that intellectual level and religious as well, and the political level, Dermot, very strong influence in the 1930s and beyond that.
Yeah, and I mean, it certainly was strong, and obviously you know a great deal more about it than I do. And I mean, it occurs to me that in an odd way, the very sign of its strength is its divisiveness, because as I read the kind of discovery and application of Chesterton's social thinking in Australia, you know, distributism, the widespread distribution of property, and that as a kind of a bulwark against, a kind of an overmighty state. You have a pretty vigorous sort of debate that goes on within kind of Catholic intellectual circles about the extent to which distributism should be the priority, or there should be other priorities. I'm thinking, for example, and maybe this is kind of a bit controversial, but the Australian academic Race Matthews, who was at whom you know well, and has spoken at your conferences, has written about the role of Bob Santamaria in the as he sees it, the marginalizing of distributism. And Bob Santamaria, of course, is a kind of a great figure in Australian Catholic life, and a formidable champion of Catholic values in public life. But as I understand Race Matthews's sort of view of distributism in Australia, and in particular Bob Santamaria's role, I mean, he sees Santamaria as kind of moving away from distributism as the way in which social Catholicism in Australia should be organised. I don't want to get into that kind of the complex argument that he makes, because it is a rather complex argument. But I'm just kind of pointing out, and I'm open to correction on this, that it's a sign of the very vigour of Catholic social philosophy in Australia at this time, that it could be kind of vociferous, that it could be that there could be pretty vigorous arguments between those who are kind of ardently distributist and those who, like Santamaria, kind of moved away from an earlier enthusiasm for distributism to another vision.
Yes, this is, of course, as you intimate, Dermot, a very much debated, very complex subject, which we probably don't have time to go through the intricacies of today. But I think to I suppose just come to the point about it, the ideas, particularly their political application through the Campion Society, and say in the rural area through a very fine movement called the National Catholic Rural Movement that was very active in rural Victoria and New South Wales and Queensland. The impact of these ideas did move into the actual political sphere, not just the sphere of advocacy and writing and intellectual groups, but political action. And then, of course, the tremendous rise of communist influence, particularly in the trade unions of Australia, during and following the Second World War, I think turned this movement of Catholic intellectuals who were politically concerned and active into bringing that influence to bear within one of our major parties, the Australian Labor Party. And that culminated in what's called the Labor Split of 1955, where there was an expulsion of members, and they were very largely people who were Catholic and associated with this political movement, which had become anti-communist, in particular to combat communism in the unions and elsewhere. And that therefore led to, I guess, a minimising of other ideas like distributism. But it's a much debated subject. I think Race's point is valid in the sense that it did in a way postpone the coming to grips again with Chesterton's ideas, given the modern revival of interest, which of course the founder of the Institute, the Chesterton Review, Father Boyd, has played such a crucial role in, that Australia did respond to this. But I can remember in the 1970s when a successor body to the Campion Society came into being. I was part of the founding group, called the Campion Fellowship. It emerged in 1972, and one of the things, given that it had people from the different states of Australia, we were very conscious of was that we were going to transcend those divisions. We weren't going to, as it were, relive them or try to replicate them in our new efforts to bring the light of faith to the very different challenges of our time and our society in the 1970s and beyond. So, but it did, I guess, lead to a postponement of that vitality. Fortunately, I think there has been, very good signs of new vitality since that time. Most obviously with the birth of the Australian Chesterton Society some years later.
Yeah, and we can certainly talk about that in a moment. I mean, I suppose just kind of getting back very, very briefly to the point that I was making a moment ago. In some ways, it's kind of it's beautifully typical of Catholic intellectuals that they fight among each other, and as it all comes down in some ways to personality. I mean, Bob Santamaria, as you well know, had a very, very powerful personality, and a man whose ideas you knew immediately whenever you met him. I didn't have the pleasure of meeting him, but I certainly know a certain amount about him. And I mean, you look at the distributism movement in England, and you've got the same kind of let's say colourful personalities, so Australia in that sense is not remotely different from any other kind of Chestertonian community that wants to sort of explore the application of Chestertonian thinking. Personalities are important.
Yes, they are, and yes, and Bob Santamaria, yes, was a phenomenally important, influential, and charismatic figure in all that he did. So he led from the front and had a great following. So I think it does always raise the issue and the dilemma for particularly, I guess, areas in social philosophy, thinking again of Chesterton's, the application of these ideas in various countries, how when they get involved in the actual political process, where voting matters and having the numbers and all of those political realities, they're inevitably going to produce great disagreements, which means that people then end up using all their energies disagreeing with each other, even if they're in fundamental agreement. But they don't get round to dealing too often with the fundamentals anymore because they're so concerned with the tactics and the strategies of application.
Absolutely. I mean, Karl, could we sort of maybe move on a little and talk about the Chesterton revival in Australia? I mean, you've spoken a little about the Campion Society and so on, but could you give a kind of a brief little pen picture or history of how interest in Chesterton has revived in Australia in, say, the last 20 years or so?
Yes, well, I think it's taken place since the 1990s, Dermot, and again, I think there's been because of what has proved to be an international Chesterton movement, particularly centred on the great work of Father Boyd in the Institute, the Chesterton Review, founded in 1974. More recently in America, and again more broadly, I think the Society for Gilbert Keith Chesterton, Dale Orquist is the president of. The effect of those movements has certainly been felt in Australia and raised the level of awareness and appreciation of Chesterton. So again, there's been, I think, that intellectual response across all kinds of people. For example, just in literature, there's an Australian author and broadcaster, Kel Richards, and some years ago he produced a book called Murder in the Mummy's Tomb, in which instead of Chesterton being the creator of a fictional detective, Father Brown, Chesterton and his wife actually figure as characters in that novel. So that kind of thing certainly happened. You quoted Les Murray early on, Australia's great poet, and he was certainly a great devotee of Chesterton. I asked him before he became, when he became a Catholic, which was in the late 1960s, whether Chesterton had been an influence on his conversion, and he said he only discovered Chesterton after he became a Catholic. But he did have a great appreciation of Chesterton. So I think in the world of literature, there's been appreciation. And then culturally and particularly educationally, the most obvious sign, I suppose, has been the creation of Campion College, Australia's first liberal arts college in Sydney in 2006, and the name was reinvoked. The Campion tradition in Australia was certainly Campion Society, Campion Fellowship, then moving to the Campion College. And at one stage, not entirely facetiously, I wondered whether we ought to call it Chesterton College. And given that Chesterton was a one-man liberal arts program who wrote on everything and in every genre, we would only set Chesterton. So in literature, you could study his novels and his poetry and his plays. In history, you could read his works of history. In philosophy, you could read orthodoxy. In theology, the four core subjects that constitute the Campion program of the liberal arts, you could study Chesterton's writings on theology. So I could think of a narrower curriculum than that, Dermot, but we have got a great many other writers and works, of course, that students study at Campion.
Yeah, well, Campion is kind of a wonderful tribute, not only to Chesterton, but to yourself, of course. And, you should be acknowledged as, just a profoundly important progenitor of this marvelous experiment. Let's not call it an experiment. Let's call it a reality. It's a beautiful thing, and here we can see it. Yeah, I mean, I'm struck by the intellectual vitality of the Chesterton moment in Australia. I mean, I'm the happy recipient of the defendant, and to those of our audience who don't know it, the defendant is. I mean, here's a copy of it. I mean, Karl had another slide of it, but it's very, very well worth reading. I'm sure our Australian friends subscribe to it. But if you don't get the defendant, it's certainly well worth looking at. And what I see in the defendant, of course, are your annual conferences at Campion, and you only have to look at the speakers and the topics to recognize that this is intellectual work of a very high order. I mean, this isn't simply a kind of sort of naive enthusiasm for Chesterton. I mean, this is hard intellectual work which is being done by scholars and writers and journalists of the very highest caliber. And to that effect, or to that point, I mean, let me put up, the proceedings of the last conference, and this is Chesterton and Women, Romance and Reality, the papers from the 2021 conference, and these are marvelous papers written by really top class, thoughtful academics, and the really encouraging thing, Karl, is that so many of these Chestertonians are young. I mean, they are recent graduates of Campion College, or they are, academics at the beginning of their academic career. So we have another 40 good years of Chestertonian thinking that will come out of the work that is being done at the moment. So I just warmly commend you on being the impresario that brings together these marvelously thoughtful people. And of course, ultimately, it's Chesterton who's the impresario. It's Chesterton is the man who brings everybody together. So I'm really struck by how vital, how lively, how intelligent the Australian Chesterton world is, and how it operates at such a powerful intellectual level.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you, Dermot. Just to look, say, a couple of the slides that have been up. The one I think currently up is a young Tony Evans, who founded what was the Chesterton Society in Western Australia, and then in 2000 it became the Australian Chesterton Society. But also next to Tony Evans in that slide is a front page of the Defendant, which features Greg Sheridan's writings on Chesterton. He's one of Australia's best known, most experienced journalists. He's a long-time foreign editor of the Australian newspaper and a great Chestertonian who has written two important books on Christianity in Australia, God is Good for You and Christians, both still available, come out in recent years. And he quotes Chesterton liberally in these books. He told me recently that in a podcast he's doing on each of the chapters of the second book called Christians, with a Scottish Presbyterian minister, David Robertson, that it's a competition between him and David as to who will quote Chesterton first during the podcast. So that's just a sign of a contemporary, well-known Australian journalist who is unashamed in his admiration of Chesterton. The next slide that came up, I think, after that one, might have been 20. Had just an image of Campion College that we discussed. That's just the main building at Campion, and I think the following slide shows the three of the five contributors to that conference, the papers that you held up. Thank you, Chesterton, and Angela Schumann, Francis Cantrell in the middle, Siobhan Reeves on the right. They're three graduates of Campion College, making their way in different ways in Australia, and all of them contributed papers to that conference.
Yeah, and very good papers they were. I think, Karl, we might do two things. There's a wonderful image of Chesterton as an Australian, and maybe we could go to that, and then maybe we could pass it back to Gloria, who will ask a few questions. So this is a kind of marvelous picture, and so Gloria, it's over to you. Are you? Yep, Gloria. Yep.
Yep, I am here. I'm here. Well, thank you so much. It's been great and very much enjoyed by everyone who has joined us today. We have a couple of questions that have arrived through the chat. The first one comes from Joseph Furolo. His question is as follows. In Australia, currently, we're beginning to recognize the deep and ancient and continuous Indigenous Aboriginal culture and history. What was Chesterton's sensibility about Indigenous cultures in general and their intrinsic value, and also as collateral of colonialism?
I think I'll leave Karl to respond to that.
Yes, well, I think I guess at the general level, he was deeply sympathetic to Indigenous culture. When it comes to Australia specifically, he didn't write very much on it. In The Everlasting Man, he does talk briefly about Aboriginal culture and admires its monotheism, its strong moral tone. So what he does say about Indigenous Aboriginal culture in Australia, however briefly, is admiring. I don't know, Dermot, you might correct me, but certainly as far as Australia goes, I don't think, again, he engaged in any substantial comment about what imperial rule in Australia, British rule in particular, had done to damage or even destroy Indigenous culture.
No, I don't. I don't think he did. And I think you're right to draw attention to the Everlasting Man as the great work of Chesterton's later years. I mean, it's a kind of it's an obvious masterpiece, and in that, I mean, he explores in a very deep way. Indigenous culture, and in a very sympathetic way. Now, obviously, in his more jocular pieces, I mean, he can make remarks that we would nowadays not consider to be particularly politically correct. Kind of joshing references to native culture. But on the whole, the Everlasting Man shows someone who is very sympathetic to the kind of the profound sort of religious identity, the spirituality, if you will, of Indigenous culture. Yeah.
Yes, I think he was so sensitive to and appreciative of the religious roots of cultures, of course, and he would have seen that in Indigenous cultures and particularly one as ancient as the Australian Aboriginal culture, going back tens of thousands of years, just how deeply rooted it was in their culture. It wasn't something sort of superficially understood, but practiced with all the fibres of their being. So
that's right, and I mean the other person to read in this respect is Christopher Dawson, who's very much of the same view. Obviously, the great Catholic revival in Australia that you've talked about, includes writers other than Chesterton, and one of those would be Christopher Dawson, who's very sympathetic to those kind of deep spiritual roots in all civilizations, actually.
Yes, that's right. His influence, yes, on the establishment of Campion was profound. Chesterton and Dawson. Dawson I've always regarded as the intellectual architect of Campion, because his book, The Crisis of Western Education in 1961, laid out a program that in my late teenage years inspired me to really give thought to such a college and just nurse that desire for 40 years. When I spoke to the initial staff at the college in 2006, I said it had taken nearly 4 decades for Campion College to become an overnight success. So these ideas do take a while to percolate down and spread out.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And continuing on the topic of Campion College, we have a question from Tom Fitzpatrick. Could you tell us more about how Chesterton is included in the Campion curriculum? And is there an elective, for example, reviewing his contribution?
Yes, so there's no formal study of Chesterton as part of the curriculum. It would be more informally done. I think, like lots of things, there's only so much going to be accommodated within a core curriculum. There's been at different times, with students interested, a kind of a Chesterton discussion club that's come up at different points in the last 17 years of Campion's history. I suppose the main sign of the influence on the student staff and others is all of the conferences, usually annual conferences, that the Australian Chesterton Society holds are at Campion College, and the students certainly attend those, and that often can lead to a spark of interest in reading Chesterton. There's a special Chesterton collection in the Campion Library, which has a very significant set of the Chesterton Review as part of it. So it's one of those, if you like, additional elements rather than part of the core curriculum that just is a broader presence, I suppose, at Campion.
Okay, thank you. And I have one other question, a couple of questions into one, also for Karl. Question is from Janine Simedi, and the question is as follows. What is the name of your book and a specific focus of your research? How and when did Australia come to be categorized as so mysterious and unknown? And where would you suggest students begin to research, especially regarding religious tensions in the country? So I can, if you want, I can go one by one, but those are the three in one.
Might make it easier. Thanks, Gloria. I know
Okay, so the first one is, what is the name of your book and the specific focus of your research?
Yes, well, it's a more modest work, I think, than a booklet I would describe it as. But in 1974, coinciding with the centenary of Chesterton's birth, when the Chesterton Review began, an important year for Chestertonians, I did a biographical study, an introduction really to Chesterton for a body called the Australian Catholic Truth Society in Melbourne. And then later, in 2008, it was slightly updated and republished by the Catholic Truth Society in London. So it's simply called G.K. Chesterton. Could be found through just putting my name and G.K. Chesterton together, available on via a Google search. That's it. Yes, that's the.
I don't know if you can see it.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
That looks like me now than when I wrote it, actually.
Okay, the second question is, how and when did Australia come to be categorized as so mysterious and unknown?
Yes, I'm not sure I can trace the origins of that. In any specific way, if the inquirer is quoting Chesterton, I think in a way the mysteriousness comes out in that point that Dermot raised earlier of the metaphysical emptiness of Australia, how its struggle with faith, and the irony of having people of great faith, very active faith, who apply that faith, but at the public level, that hasn't had the same quite the same manifestations as would be more characteristic, obviously, of Europe. So yes, I probably can't elaborate further on that particular statement.
And the last part of the question is, where would you suggest students to begin to research, especially regarding religious tensions in the country?
Yes, well, there's been a great amount written on that. There's no book that immediately comes to mind. I'd have to say on that. There's been certainly many studies around what I mentioned earlier, the Labor split of the mid-1950s, and the degree to which sectarian tensions entered into that. And certainly there's been very fine work by historians like Gregory Haynes, for example, and others. Haynes is Haines, writing about the religious development, specifically the Christian and Catholic developments in Australia over the years, right from the beginning. Australia was unusual in having, however oppressed the original Catholics would have been, and they were, and convicts and others that came later, but Australian Catholics were there from the beginning, and that has a different effect on a society from where they come, as perhaps was more the case in America, where the events like the Great Irish Famine in the mid-19th century brought tremendous waves of immigrants, but they already came to a country that was already, in a sense, except for Maryland, for Catholics, was already settled. The configuration of the country religiously and culturally was already fairly well established. So that can lead to all sorts of difficulties that are not quite the same for when people of different religions all arrive together, however much the tensions that there are. That makes it, they've somehow got to get along. They've somehow got to get on.
Okay, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add a little footnote to that, Karl, that there's a kind of a double, there's an irony here, which is that Australia was obviously part of the British Empire, but it was also part of a great spiritual empire that we would associate with Irish Catholicism. And, one thinks of Cardinal Moran or Archbishop Mannix and so on. And you can trace not a small amount of the kind of spiritual roots of Australia to Maynooth and to Cardinal Cullen, who was, of course, the kind of patron of so many of the early bishops of Australia. I'm making an argument for a benign empire, and that is the empire of Irish Catholicism in Australia.
Profound significance and very much foundational, so that, as I guess in the case of the American Catholic Church, a tremendous influence by Irish Catholics. That was in the beginning with the convicts, and then free settlers, later immigrants. So many did come out from Ireland and saw it as a new country in which they didn't have to necessarily in the main rehearse all of the great conflicts of the old world. They could do what they can to create a new life in the new world. So I think that's had in all sorts of ways in our literature, in our art, in the great buildings. The Irish Catholic bishops and cardinals were great builders. They built magnificent churches, a tremendous school system at both the primary and secondary level. Interestingly, unlike America, not at the tertiary level, so that Catholic universities were very much a later development here, unlike the experience of the United States and Canada and so on.
Yeah.
Okay, a couple of quick questions as we are approaching the end of the program. Karl, how big is the Australian Chesterton Society at the moment?
Yes, it have about 200 members on its mailing list. And we also do have very, very happily our international members, the people at the Chesterton Institute. We have individuals, of course, in different countries, but I think it is very much a national association. We have members in each state, the more populous states of New South Wales and Victoria and Queensland in particular, but we're blessed with members from throughout Australia, and many of them, as I mentioned, Greg Sheridan earlier. There's others who write for The Defendant, our quarterly newsletter, so they're active readers and writers on Chesterton topics.
And Dermot, if you could, we only have a couple of minutes left and we want to make a couple of announcements after. Very quickly, why should you read Chesterton today? Of course, that answer could be long, but if we come to in 30 seconds.
Oh,
impossible.
Answers or Karl?
Sorry, David.
No.
Either one.
I'm happy just to say that Chester is a wonderful writer. I imagine that most of the people who are with us are Chestertonians or are generally interested in Chesterton. Chesterton is at the heart of so many conversations. He's has things to say about economics, about politics, about the family, about culture, about to be very simple, about life, and Chesterton has a kind of connected view of life, connected view of reality. And I think the two things that seem to jump off the page when we look at Chesterton is a sense of wonder and a sense of gratitude. he gives praise. His whole life, in a way, is a kind of a song of praise for life itself, and that is why I think Chesterton is such a compelling writer, such an attractive writer, and of course such a wonderfully clever and funny writer. So those are very broadly the reasons why people should read Chesterton.
Thank you very much. And on that note of gratitude, we would like to thank our speakers for such a great conversation. And I would also like to thank all the people who joined us today from different corners of the world. And I would like also to take this moment to say that in the next few days, we will send a notice out about with a link to the video recording of this presentation, in case you were not able to attend to the whole presentation. But I also would like to share a little bit of information as we come to an end, and by inviting you to mark your calendar for our next online event. Our next online event is on the topic of Follow the Science with G.K. Chesterton and Father Stanley Yagi. It is being co-sponsored by the Chesterton Institute for Faith and Culture and Inside the Vatican magazine. Our speakers will be Dr. Robert Moynihan, founder and editor of Inside the Vatican, Dr. Geir Hasnes, Chesterton bibliographer and editor of Chesterton in Black and White, and Dr. Dermot Quinn, professor of history and editor of the Chesterton Review. The event will be on Thursday, March 31st from 1:30 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and it will be transmitted via Zoom. I ask you to please mark your calendar, and hopefully that you will be able to join us. If you're not in our mailing list, please write to us at chestertoninstitute@shu.edu. And a last friendly reminder that the fall-winter issue of the Chesterton Review, volume 47, numbers 3 and 4, was a special Stanley Yagi issue. And if you would like to subscribe, renew, or purchase this issue, please also send us an email to the same email, chestertoninstitute@shu.edu. And if you're not yet a subscriber, we invite you to consider subscribing to our journal. We are in our 48th year of continuous publication, and we hope that you will join us on the journey as we approach our half a century. So thank you again, and until the next time, March 31st. Thank you, Karl. Thank you, Dermot. Thank you, Michael, and everyone who joined us today. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks.
It's delightful.